From the sky, it looked like any other American suburb. Neat rows of houses, tree-lined streets, cars in driveways. But no one lived there. Not a single family. Not one child. Because underneath that quiet neighborhood sat one of the largest aircraft factories ever built, pumping out bombers at a rate that would decide the fate of the world. 30,000 workers. A new B-17 every 24 hours. The entire operation invisible to enemy eyes until the war ended. So how did Boeing hide an empire in plain sight? The answer involves Hollywood, deception, and secrets that cost more than anyone admitted. The story of Boeing doesn't start with bombers or billion-dollar contracts. It starts with a rich kid who got obsessed with flying machines. William Edward Boeing was born in 1881 in Detroit. His father, a German immigrant, had made a fortune in timber and iron ore. When the old man died, young Bill inherited enough money to never work a day in his life. But inherited wealth creates restless men, and Boeing was restless to his core. He moved to Seattle in 1903, ostensibly to manage timber holdings. Really because the Pacific Northwest felt like the edge of the world, a place where a man could reinvent himself. Boeing tried various ventures: timber, real estate, yacht racing. Nothing stuck. Then, in 1910, he attended an air show in Los Angeles and watched a pilot named Louis Paul Hahn fly a flimsy contraption of wood and canvas through the California sky. That moment changed everything. Boeing became obsessed. He wanted to fly. More than that, he wanted to build the machines that flew. In 1915, he finally got his chance to ride in a seaplane piloted by a barnstormer named Tara Maroney. The experience was transformative, but Boeing, ever the perfectionist, spent the whole flight critiquing the aircraft's design. He turned to his friend Conrad Westervelt, a Navy engineer, and said the words that would launch an empire. "I think we could build a better one." And they did. Working out of a boathouse on Lake Union, Boeing and Westervelt constructed their first aircraft in 1916, the B&W seaplane. Wanted crude by later standards, but it flew. Boeing incorporated his company that same year, calling it Pacific Aero Products Company. A year later, he renamed it Boeing Airplane Company. The timing was accidental genius. America was about to enter World War I, and suddenly the government needed planes. Boeing secured his first military contract in 1917, 50 Model C trainer aircraft for the Navy. The order was small, but it established something crucial. Boeing could deliver. When the war ended in 1918, however, the contracts dried up overnight. The government had no use for warplanes in peacetime. Civilian aviation barely existed. Boeing nearly went bankrupt. He kept the company alive by manufacturing furniture and flat-bottomed boats, sea sleds they called them. Picture that. The future of American aviation. To reduce to making boats. But Boeing was stubborn. He refused to abandon aviation entirely, even when it made no financial sense. Throughout the 1920s, the company scraped by on small contracts, mail planes, a few military orders. Nothing that suggested greatness. The American aircraft industry as a whole was an afterthought. In 1938, the entire industry employed fewer than 50,000 workers nationwide. Compare that to the automobile industry, which employed millions. Aviation was a curiosity, not a cornerstone. Then the world began to burn. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. While America officially remained neutral, President Franklin Roosevelt understood what was coming. He called for American industry to become an arsenal of democracy, capable of producing 50,000 aircraft per year. Let that sink in. At the time, the entire American aircraft industry produced fewer than 6,000 planes annually. Roosevelt's demand seemed impossible. Boeing was better positioned than most. Throughout the late 1930s, the company had been developing a revolutionary new aircraft, the Model 299, which would become the B-17 Flying Fortress, a four-engine heavy bomber capable of carrying 4,800 pounds of ordnance at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. Nothing like it existed anywhere in the world. The Army Air Corps ordered 13 in 1936, then more as tensions rose in Europe. By 1940, Boeing had a backlog of orders they couldn't possibly fill with existing facilities. The problem was scale. Boeing's main plant in Seattle could produce maybe a handful of B-17s per month. The military wanted hundreds, then thousands. The math simply didn't work. You can't build bombers without factories, and you can't build factories overnight. Except that's exactly what America was about to do. Then came December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,403 Americans and destroyed or damaged 19 naval vessels and nearly 200 aircraft. But the strategic implications went far beyond Hawaii. Suddenly, the West Coast was vulnerable. Japanese submarines had already been spotted off California. The Imperial fleet that struck Pearl Harbor could theoretically strike the American mainland. And that's when military planners confronted a terrifying realization. Boeing's factories sat directly in the potential strike zone. Plant 1 in Seattle. The new Plant 2 under construction nearby. These weren't hardened military installations. They were civilian factories with glass roofs and thin walls. A single Japanese bombing raid could cripple American bomber production for months, maybe years. The vulnerability was unacceptable, but the solution was far from obvious. You couldn't move the factories. You couldn't really defend them against a determined air attack. The anti-aircraft technology of the era simply wasn't reliable enough, so military planners landed on a different approach. In one that sounds insane until you realize it actually worked. If you can't protect the factories, hide them. Make them invisible. Convince enemy reconnaissance that there's nothing worth bombing. The idea came from multiple sources, but Army Colonel John F. Gruelke is often credited with formalizing the concept. The plan was audacious. Cover the massive factory complex with camouflage so elaborate that aerial photographs would show nothing but an ordinary American neighborhood. Houses, streets, lawns, everything a pilot would ignore. Boeing's leadership said yes. The military said yes. And in early 1942, one of the most remarkable deception operations in military history began to take shape. To understand why hiding Boeing's factories became a matter of national survival, you need to understand just how desperate America's situation was in early 1942. The Japanese military machine was rolling across the Pacific like a force of nature. Wake Island fell on December 23, 1941. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Manila was declared an open city on December 26th and occupied by Japanese forces on January 2, 1942. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore surrendered in February, the largest capitulation in British military history. 70,000 Allied troops became prisoners of war in a single day. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. Their navy controlled the Western Pacific. Their aircraft carriers had proven devastatingly effective at Pearl Harbor. They and American intelligence had no reliable way to predict where they might strike next. The west coast of the United States, once considered safely isolated by thousands of miles of ocean, suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. The psychological impact was immense. On February 23, 1942, a Japanese submarine surfaced off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, and shelled an oil refinery. The damage was minimal, 13 shells, a few oil derricks damaged. But the message was unmistakable. The enemy could reach American shores. 2 days later, the fear reached fever pitch. Radar operators in Los Angeles detected what they believed was an incoming air raid. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, sending 1,400 rounds of ammunition into the night sky. Searchlights swept the darkness. These civilians huddled in their homes, convinced the invasion had begun. It was a false alarm. The Battle of Los Angeles, as it came to be known, was triggered by nothing more than weather balloons and war nerves. But the panic was real. 3 civilians died of heart attacks. 3 more were killed by falling shell fragments. And across the country, military planners drew the obvious conclusion. If America's cities could panic this easily, what would happen if the Japanese actually attacked? What would happen if they hit the factories producing the weapons America needed to fight back? Boeing's Plant 2 was the crown jewel of American bomber production. Situated in Seattle, it sat roughly 5,000 miles from Tokyo. That sounds far. Until you consider that Japanese aircraft carriers had already proven capable of crossing vast stretches of ocean undetected. A task force launching from the Aleutian Islands, which Japan would indeed occupy in June 1942, could theoretically reach Seattle. The B-17s being assembled at Plant 2 were exactly the kind of strategic target that Japanese military planners would prioritize. The numbers told a terrifying story. In early 1942, the Army Air Forces had fewer than 200 heavy bombers in their entire inventory. Boeing was producing B-17s at a rate of roughly 60 per month, a number that would need to increase dramatically. But every single one of those bombers came from facilities that had zero protection against air attack. The factories had no hardened bunkers, no blast-resistant walls. The roofs were largely made of glass to let in natural light. One well-placed incendiary bomb could turn Plant 2 into an inferno. Military planners conducted war games. They ran scenarios. The conclusions were grim. A determined Japanese attack on Boeing's Seattle facilities could set back American bomber production by 6 months to a year. In a war where every month mattered, where Allied forces were losing ground across multiple theaters, that delay could prove catastrophic. The B-17s weren't just weapons, they were symbols. Proof that democracy could outproduce fascism. Losing the factories would be a strategic and psychological blow of incalculable magnitude. So the military faced a choice. They could try to defend the factories with anti-aircraft guns and fighter aircraft. But the Battle of Los Angeles had already demonstrated how unreliable those defenses could be. Anti-aircraft fire was notoriously inaccurate. Fighter interception required advance warning that might not come. A surprise attack at dawn or dusk could devastate the facility before defenses even engaged. The alternative was camouflage. Hide the factories so effectively that enemy reconnaissance would never identify them as targets in the first place. The concept wasn't entirely new. European nations had experimented with industrial camouflage throughout the 1930s. The Germans had hidden factories. The British had disguised airfields. But nothing had ever been attempted on the scale that Boeing's facilities would require. Plant 2 alone covered nearly 26 acres under roof. The entire complex sprawled across a much larger footprint. Hiding it would mean constructing an elaborate fake landscape, a 3-dimensional illusion visible from 10,000 feet or higher. Colonel John F. Grolke of the Army Corps of Engineers became the driving force behind the camouflage initiative. Grolke understood that traditional military camouflage wouldn't work. Painting the roofs green or brown might fool a pilot flying at low altitude, but aerial reconnaissance photography was far more sophisticated. Japanese photo interpreters would study images carefully, looking for telltale signs of industrial activity. Roads leading nowhere, parking lots without cars, shadows that didn't match the surrounding terrain. The camouflage had to be 3-dimensional, realistic, comprehensive. Grolke reached out to an unlikely source of expertise: Hollywood. The American film industry had spent decades perfecting the art of visual deception. Set designers could make a soundstage look like a European castle or an Egyptian desert. They understood perspective, force depth, and the way cameras interpreted images. More importantly, they understood how to create illusions that held up under scrutiny. If anyone could hide a factory, it was the people who created movie magic for a living. The Army established the camouflage branch of the Corps of Engineers in March 1942. They recruited artists, architects, set designers, and painters from across the country. Many came directly from Hollywood studios. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were craftsmen, these specialists in creating believable false realities. Their mission was to make Boeing's factories disappear. The project received top priority. Resources that were scarce everywhere else flowed freely to the camouflage effort. Canvas, lumber, chicken wire, paint. Thousands of workers would be needed just to construct the disguise, separate from the tens of thousands already building bombers. The timeline was aggressive. Intelligence suggested that a Japanese attack could come at any time. Every day the factories remained visible was a day of vulnerability. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the camouflage failed, America's ability to wage strategic air war against Japan would be crippled. The B-17s rolling off Boeing's lines were desperately needed in both the Pacific and European theaters. Every plane mattered. Every day of production mattered. The fate of nations hinged on whether a Hollywood set designer could hide an aircraft factory from the sky. The site they chose was Boeing Plant 2, located along the Duwamish River in Seattle. Construction on the facility had begun in 1936, long before anyone imagined it would need to be hidden. The original design prioritized function over concealment. Massive sawtooth roofs let in natural light. Enormous doors allowed aircraft components to move between buildings. The footprint was sprawling, irregular, shaped by the demands of aircraft assembly rather than any consideration of what it might look like from above. By early 1942, Plant 2 had already grown into one of the largest manufacturing facilities on the West Coast. The main assembly building covered roughly 1.6 million square feet. Additional structures housed component manufacturing, painting operations, and administrative functions. Rail lines snaked through the complex, delivering raw materials. Roads connected to the broader Seattle infrastructure. Parking lots accommodated thousands of workers arriving for each shift. From the air, the industrial nature of the site was unmistakable. The camouflage team faced immediate challenges. You couldn't simply paint the buildings to match the surrounding terrain. The sawtooth roofs created distinctive shadows that no amount of paint could disguise. The parking lots filled and emptied in predictable patterns as shifts changed. Smoke rose from various operations. The constant movement of materials and workers created activity visible from reconnaissance altitude. Every element had to be addressed, transformed, hidden. John Stuart Detley arrived from Hollywood in the spring of 1942 to oversee the camouflage design. His credentials were impeccable. He had worked as an art director on major studio productions, creating elaborate sets that convinced audiences they were seeing real places. But this project was unlike anything he had attempted before. A movie set only needed to fool the camera from specific angles. This illusion had to work from any direction, at any time of day, under any weather conditions. It had to fool trained photo interpreters studying images with magnifying glasses, looking for exactly the kind of inconsistencies that revealed deception. Detley's approach was methodical. He began by studying aerial photographs of genuine Seattle neighborhoods, analyzing how houses, streets, trees, decking, and lawns appeared from various altitudes. He noted the way shadows fell at different times of day, how vegetation patterns varied with the seasons, the subtle irregularities that made real neighborhoods look organic rather than planned. The camouflage couldn't be too perfect. Perfection would itself be suspicious. Construction began in earnest during the summer of 1942. The first step was creating a structural framework that could support the entire fake neighborhood. Workers erected a scaffolding system across the rooftops, a lattice of poles and beams that would hold the camouflage elements above the factory floor. The framework had to be strong enough to support significant weight, including the workers who would maintain the disguise, but it couldn't obstruct the factory operations below. Assembly lines kept running while the illusion took shape overhead. Chicken wire formed the foundation of most camouflage elements. Miles of it were stretched across the framework, creating surfaces onto which other materials could be attached. The wire mesh was flexible enough to be shaped into three-dimensional forms: hills, trees, the angular outlines of houses. Workers bent and twisted the wire into shapes that mimicked residential architecture, then covered it with painted canvas and burlap. The houses were particularly ingenious. Each fake structure was designed to cast appropriate shadows based on its supposed orientation. Roof lines sloped at realistic angles. Chimneys rose from corners. The walls were painted with variations in color that simulated different siding materials. And windows were represented by darker rectangles that approximated the appearance of glass from altitude. Some houses had front porches, others had attached garages. The variety was deliberate. Real neighborhoods aren't uniform, so the fake one couldn't be either. Streets connected the houses in patterns that made geographic sense. The roads followed the contours of the landscape, curving where real roads would curve, intersecting at logical angles. White lines simulated concrete sidewalks. Darker strips represented asphalt. Picture this: fire hydrants represented by small posts painted red. Street lights simulated by thin vertical elements at regular intervals. The attention to detail was obsessive, but houses and streets alone weren't enough. A neighborhood without vegetation would look wrong from the air. So the camouflage team created trees, thousands of them. The fake trees were constructed from chicken wire frames covered with chicken feathers dyed various shades of green. The feathers created a texture that approximated foliage when photographed from high altitude. Different species were simulated through variations in shape and color. Conifers had pointed profiles. Deciduous trees spread wider. The feathers would need to be changed seasonally, replaced with autumn colors in fall. Bare branches in winter. Lawns presented another challenge. The vast expanses of factory roofing couldn't simply be painted green. Paint would create an unnaturally uniform surface, immediately suspicious to trained interpreters. Instead, workers covered the areas with a mixture of materials designed to create visual variation: burlap in different shades, painted canvas sections, areas of exposed netting that allowed glimpses of darker surfaces beneath, simulating the shadows cast by grass blades. The effect was imperfect up close, but convincing from reconnaissance altitude. Cars appeared in driveways and along streets. These weren't real vehicles. They were rubber and canvas constructions, inflatable in some cases, simple shells in others. Workers positioned them in natural-looking arrangements, avoiding the geometric precision that would suggest staging. Some cars faced forward, others backed in. A few sat at slight angles, as if carelessly parked. The colors varied: blues, blacks, greens, the occasional red. Nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would look wrong. The scale of the deception was staggering. By the time construction reached its peak, the camouflage covered approximately 26 acres. More than 300 fake houses had been erected. Thousands of trees dotted the landscape. Streets wound through the installation in a pattern that connected logically to real Seattle roads at the edges of the disguised zone. Workers could walk through the fake neighborhood, which they sometimes did for maintenance purposes, and feel like they were strolling through a suburb, rather than standing atop an aircraft factory. The maintenance requirements were constant. Rain damaged materials. Wind shifted elements out of position. The painted surfaces faded under the Pacific Northwest's persistent overcast skies. Dedicated crews worked continuously, replacing damaged sections, repainting faded colors, ensuring that the illusion remained convincing through every season. When autumn came for Teenpoint Wound Resteldim for Keen, the team changed the tree feathers to browns and oranges. When winter arrived, they removed foliage entirely from deciduous specimens, added occasional patches of white to simulate snow. The camouflage net itself was a marvel of engineering. Stretched above the entire complex, it unified the individual elements into a coherent landscape. The netting was painted in patterns that broke up the factory's geometric outlines, creating an organic visual texture that blended with the surrounding terrain. By late 1942, the installation was substantially complete. Aerial photographs taken during this period are remarkable. They show what appears to be an ordinary Seattle neighborhood. Houses with cars and driveways, tree-lined streets. Nothing that would attract the attention of an enemy bombardier searching for strategic targets. The factory had vanished. In its place stood a suburb that existed only in two dimensions. A flat projection of normalcy stretched across the roof of America's air power. Beneath that fake suburb, an industrial revolution was underway. The camouflage protected not just buildings, but an operation that would reshape the course of the war. Production inside Plant 2 ramped up at a pace that seemed impossible, driven by desperate necessity, fueled by an endless supply of willing workers. Every bomber that rolled off the line represented thousands of individual components, millions of rivets, countless hours of human labor. The scale was unprecedented in American manufacturing history. The B-17 Flying Fortress was the star of the operation. This four-engine heavy bomber had become the symbol of American air power, the plane that would carry the war to the enemy's doorstep. Each B-17 contained approximately 150,000 rivets. Its wingspan stretched 103 feet. It could fly at altitudes exceeding 35,000 feet, above the effective range of most enemy fighters and anti-aircraft systems. Building one required coordinating the production of engines, electronics, armaments, airframe components, and hundreds of other systems. Boeing had mastered this complexity. In 1942, Plant 2 produced approximately 60 B-17s per month. That number sounds impressive, until you consider the military's demands. The Army Air Forces wanted hundreds per month, eventually thousands. The gap between production capacity and operational requirements threatened to undermine the entire strategic bombing campaign. So Boeing expanded. They added shifts. They streamlined processes. They recruited workers from every corner of America. By 1943, production had tripled. By 1944, the factory was producing bombers at a rate that would have seemed hallucinatory just 2 years earlier. A new B-17 rolled off the line every 24 hours. Let that sink in. Every single day, a fully assembled heavy bomber emerged from the camouflaged factory, ready for combat. The workers who made this happen numbered in the tens of thousands. At peak production, Boeing employed over 30,000 people at the Seattle facilities alone. But the B-17 was only part of the story. In 1942, Boeing also began producing an even more advanced aircraft at a separate facility in Renton, just south of Seattle. The B-29 Superfortress was the most sophisticated bomber of the war, perhaps the most complex aircraft ever built to that point. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to fly at extreme altitudes without supplemental oxygen. Its remote-controlled gun turrets represented cutting-edge weapons technology. Its range of nearly 3,500 miles made it capable of striking targets deep in enemy territory. The B-29 program was shrouded in even greater secrecy than the B-17 operation. This was the aircraft that would eventually drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in 1943 and 44, it was simply the weapon that military planners believed could bring Japan to its knees through conventional bombing. The Renton facility received its own elaborate camouflage. The workforce that made all this possible was unlike anything America had seen before. The war had drained the traditional labor pool. Millions of young men had enlisted or been drafted. The factories needed bodies, skilled hands capable of performing precise work under difficult conditions. So they turned to populations that had previously been excluded from industrial employment. Women flooded into the plants by the thousands. They comprised roughly 40% of the workforce at peak production, performing tasks that had been considered exclusively male just months earlier. Rosie the Riveter became the iconic symbol of this transformation, but the reality was more complex than the propaganda posters suggested. Women worked as riveters, yes, but also as welders, electricians, inspectors, assembly technicians. They operated heavy machinery, they read blueprints, they worked alongside men in conditions of equality that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Okay, the necessity of war had shattered assumptions about what women could and couldn't do. Minorities also found unprecedented opportunities in the aircraft plants. African Americans migrated from the South to take factory jobs that offered wages far exceeding anything available in the Jim Crow economy. The Great Migration accelerated dramatically during the war years, with Boeing and other defense contractors serving as powerful magnets. Mexican Americans, Native Americans, immigrants from various backgrounds, all found places on the assembly lines. The factories weren't utopias of racial harmony. Discrimination persisted, but the color of your skin mattered less when bombers needed building. The propaganda machine worked overtime to maintain morale and support production goals. Posters covered factory walls, urging workers to higher output. "You loose lips sink ships. We can do it. A slip of the lip may sink a ship." The messaging was relentless. Every rivet driven was a blow against fascism. Every hour of overtime brought victory closer. The workers were soldiers in their own right, waging war not with rifles, but with welding torches and rivet guns. Celebrities toured the facilities, boosting morale, generating publicity. Hollywood stars posed with workers for photographs that appeared in newspapers nationwide. The message was clear. Building bombers was glamorous, patriotic, essential. The factory floor was a stage, and the workers were heroes. Never mind the exhausting hours, the dangerous conditions, the constant pressure to produce more, faster, better. The cause was righteous, and righteousness demanded sacrifice. The production numbers tell a story of astonishing achievement. Boeing's Seattle and Renton facilities collectively produced over 12,000 B-17s and nearly 3,000 B-29s during the war. Those numbers don't include the aircraft produced by other manufacturers under Boeing license: Lockheed, Douglas. Other companies built B-17s using Boeing designs, multiplying the output exponentially. By war's end, America had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft, more than any nation in history. The camouflage held throughout this entire period. Not a single enemy bomb ever fell on Boeing's Seattle facilities. The fake neighborhood maintained its illusion year after year, protecting the industry beneath it. Japanese reconnaissance flights, had they occurred, ears would have photographed nothing but residential streets. The deception was complete, but the triumph of production masked a darker reality that was already beginning to emerge. The workers building these bombers weren't automatons. They were human beings with physical limitations, emotional needs, lives outside the factory gates. The pace demanded by wartime production ground them down in ways that the propaganda never acknowledged. The first cracks in the system were appearing, invisible from above, just like the factory beneath its camouflaged skin. The propaganda posters showed smiling workers, proud, energized, ready to do their part. The reality was grimmer. Workers clocked in for shifts that stretched 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours. Overtime wasn't optional. It was expected, demanded, practically mandatory. The military needed bombers, and the military's needs superseded everything else. Family time evaporated. Sleep became a luxury. Workers stumbled through their days in states of chronic exhaustion, bodies aching, minds numbed by repetitive tasks performed hundreds of times per shift. The riveting guns vibrated until hands went numb. The noise levels caused permanent hearing damage. The smells of solvents and lubricants saturated clothing and skin. And the accidents. The accidents happened constantly. The factory floor was a maze of hazards, sharp metal edges, heavy components swinging from overhead cranes, electrical systems carrying enough current to kill, pneumatic tools that could shatter bones if they slipped. Workers lost fingers to stamping presses. They suffered burns from welding arcs. They inhaled fumes that wouldn't reveal their damage for decades. Safety protocols existed on paper, but they crumbled under production pressure. When the military demanded more bombers, supervisors pushed harder. Corners got cut. Training got shortened. New workers barely learned one station before being moved to another. The experienced hands who might have caught mistakes were spread too thin across an ever-expanding workforce. Incidents that should have triggered investigations got swept aside, because stopping the line meant losing aircraft. The women faced particular challenges that the propaganda never mentioned. They worked in a culture that hadn't been designed for them. Restroom facilities were inadequate. The physical demands of the work caused injuries that male-oriented safety guidelines never anticipated. Sexual harassment existed but had no name, no recourse, no official recognition. Women who complained risked being labeled troublemakers, which could mean losing a job that paid better than anything they'd find elsewhere. So they endured. They did the work. They kept their mouths shut. Racial tensions simmered beneath the surface of the factory's outward unity. African American workers faced discrimination in housing, having been herded into overcrowded neighborhoods while white workers found better accommodations. On the factory floor, they were often assigned the dirtiest, most dangerous tasks. Promotion opportunities were limited, social integration was minimal. The war demanded their labor, but it didn't demand their equality. The same patterns repeated for other minority groups, essential enough to work, not equal enough to matter. The secrecy surrounding the operations added another layer of psychological burden. Workers couldn't discuss what they did with anyone outside the plant. Not spouses, not parents, not friends. The war demanded discretion, and violating that trust carried severe consequences. Propaganda reminded them constantly. Enemy ears are listening. Careless talk costs lives. Picture this. You spend 12 hours building bombers. You come home exhausted. Your spouse asks how your day was, and you can't say a word. The weight of maintaining silence about your daily life, about the exhaustion and the dangers and the frustrations, created its own kind of stress, a loneliness that couldn't be shared. Some workers cracked under the pressure. Absenteeism rates climbed as the war dragged on. People simply didn't show up, their bodies and minds refusing to continue. Turnover was constant. New faces appeared every week, replacing those who had quit or been fired or simply vanished. The training burden this created compounded the stress on experienced workers, who had to teach newcomers while maintaining their own production quotas. The system demanded more than humans could sustainably give. Medical care for injured workers was perfunctory at best. Industrial accidents were treated as quickly as possible, so workers could return to their stations. Long-term disabilities meant losing your job. Workers' compensation existed, but was minimal. The assumption was simple. You'd recover and return, or you'd be replaced. The human cost didn't appear on production reports. It didn't factor into the calculations that measured success in bombers per month. Housing shortages plagued the entire Seattle area as workers flooded in from across the country. Families doubled and tripled up in apartments designed for single occupants. Makeshift housing developments sprang up on the city's fringes. thrown together without adequate sanitation or services. Workers commuted hours each way on overcrowded buses, arriving exhausted before their shifts even began. The infrastructure simply couldn't keep pace with the population explosion that war production demanded. The children of these workers grew up in a strange world. Their parents disappeared into factories for most of their waking hours, building machines the children couldn't see and couldn't discuss. Schools were overcrowded. Supervision was minimal. Many children took jobs of their own, contributing to household incomes that never quite stretched far enough. The war years stole childhoods along with everything else, and yet the bombers kept rolling off the lines. That was the brutal arithmetic of wartime production. Human suffering was an input, not an obstacle. As long as the output continued, the system was working. The camouflage overhead hid the factory from enemy eyes. Nothing hid the workers from exploitation. They were visible, expendable, and essential, all at once. The peak came in 1944, so production reached levels that seemed impossible. The factory hummed around the clock, 3 shifts cycling through in endless rotation. The war in Europe was reaching its climax. D-Day had opened a second front. Allied bombers were devastating German industry, proving the strategic value of the aircraft being built beneath Seattle's fake suburb. Every B-17 that dropped bombs on Nazi factories justified the sacrifices being made to build it. Or so the propaganda claimed. But even as production peaked, the end was approaching. Military planners knew the war wouldn't last forever. The tide had turned. Germany was collapsing. Japan, though still fighting fiercely, was increasingly isolated. The factories that had ramped up at superhuman speed would eventually have to ramp down. The question was when? And what would happen to the workers who had given everything to the war effort? Nobody was asking that question out loud. Not yet. The dark truth behind Boeing's wartime miracle wasn't hidden beneath camouflage netting. It was hidden in plain sight, in the faces of exhausted workers, in the injury reports that nobody read, in the segregated housing and the silent harassment and the children growing up without parents. The factory produced bombers. It also produced broken people. Both outcomes were treated as acceptable costs in the pursuit of victory. The environmental costs accumulated silently alongside the human ones. Aircraft manufacturing in the 1940s involved chemicals that nobody fully understood: degreasers, solvents, paints, hydraulic fluids. These substances were essential to production, and their disposal was an afterthought at best. Waste went into the ground, into the water, into the air. The Duwamish River, which ran alongside Plant 2, absorbed decades of industrial runoff. Heavy metals settled into the sediment. Petroleum compounds seeped through the soil. The contamination was invisible, tasteless, odorless. Its effects would take generations to manifest. Workers inhaled fumes daily without protective equipment. The concept of occupational health barely existed. If a chemical didn't cause immediate, obvious harm, it was considered safe enough. Asbestos insulated pipes and electrical systems throughout the facility. Workers breathed in fibers that would later seed cancers in their lungs. Lead-based paints coated surfaces everywhere. Chrome plating operations released hexavalent chromium into the air. The factory was a toxic environment disguised as a workplace, and nobody had the language or the data to describe what was happening. The communities surrounding the plants bore the burden, along with the workers. Air quality in industrial Seattle deteriorated measurably during the war years. Ash and particulates settled on homes, on gardens, on children playing in yards. The smell of industry permeated everything. Residents complained, but complaints went nowhere. National security trumped local concerns. The war effort couldn't be impeded by worried neighbors or environmental regulations that didn't exist yet. Then, the war ended. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another B-29 destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. After nearly 4 years of total war, the fighting was over. In factories across America, the news spread through assembly lines like wildfire. Workers cheered, some wept. The nightmare was ending. But for Boeing's workforce, the end of the war was the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. The contracts that had sustained production for years evaporated almost overnight. The military didn't need 30,000 workers building bombers anymore. It didn't need bombers anymore. Well, no, period. The wartime economy had created jobs that peacetime couldn't sustain, and Boeing, like every other defense contractor, had to shed workers by the tens of thousands. The layoffs began immediately. September 1945 saw the first wave, then October, then November. Each week brought new announcements, new names on lists, new families suddenly without income. Workers who had been told they were essential, that their labor was saving civilization, were now expendable. The same management that had demanded overtime and sacrifice now handed out pink slips with bureaucratic efficiency. The numbers were staggering. Boeing's Seattle area workforce had peaked at approximately 45,000 workers. By the end of 1945, it had been cut to fewer than 15,000. By 1946, it fell below 10,000, 2/3 of the workforce, gone in less than a year. The human beings behind those numbers scattered to the winds. Some returned to the regions they'd migrated from, defeated and depleted. Others stayed in Seattle, competing for jobs in an economy suddenly flooded with unemployed workers. The women were pushed out first and fastest. With men returning from military service, the social expectation was clear. Women should return to their homes, make room for the veterans, resume their natural roles as wives and mothers. The propaganda that had celebrated Rosie the Riveter pivoted overnight to propaganda celebrating domesticity. Women who had proven themselves capable of any industrial task were suddenly deemed unsuitable for the workforce. Many went without protest, exhausted by years of grueling labor. Others fought to keep jobs they'd earned, only to find the system rigged against them. African American workers faced similar dynamics amplified by racism. The wartime necessity that had opened doors now closed them again. White veterans received preferential hiring. Black workers were last hired and first fired. The brief window of opportunity that the war had created slammed shut. Many migrated again, seeking better prospects in other cities, carrying skills that peacetime America didn't want to employ. The camouflage came down. With no enemy to deceive, there was no reason to maintain the elaborate illusion. Workers dismantled the fake houses, the rubber cars, the feathered trees. The chicken wire frameworks were cut apart and carted away. The canvas and burlap were disposed of. Piece by piece, the suburban neighborhood that had never existed was erased from existence. What remained was the factory roof, exposed to the sky for the first time in years. Photographs from this period are eerie. They show the industrial buildings stark and naked, stripped of their disguise. The sawtooth roofs that the camouflage had concealed now caught the light without pretense. Roads that had appeared to wind through a residential neighborhood now obviously led nowhere, ending abruptly at factory walls. The illusion was gone. The secret was out. But by then it didn't matter. The enemy had been defeated. The concealment had served its purpose. The factory itself contracted along with the workforce. Entire sections were shuttered, their equipment mothballed or sold. The cavernous spaces that had once hummed with bomber production fell silent. Dust accumulated on idle machinery. The skeleton crew that remained rattled around in facilities designed for 10 times their number. The communities that had grown up around Boeing's plants suffered enormously. Housing that had been scarce during the war suddenly sat vacant. Businesses that had served factory workers closed their doors. The economic multiplier that had created prosperity now operated in reverse, each lost job eliminating others downstream. Seattle's wartime boom became a post-war bust. The city that had swelled with migrants now hemorrhaged population. For the workers who had built the bombers, there was no gratitude, no recognition, no assistance in transitioning to peacetime life. They had done their duty. The nation had moved on. Veterans received GI Bill benefits, the access to education and housing that would lift millions into the middle class. Factory workers received nothing comparable. They were on their own, carrying the physical and psychological scars of wartime production into a world that didn't want to hear about them. The legacy of what they had built and what had been done to them would take decades to fully understand. Boeing survived the post-war collapse, but just barely. The company that had employed tens of thousands found itself scrambling for any contract it could secure. Military orders had dried up. Commercial aviation barely existed. The massive infrastructure built for wartime production sat mostly idle, a monument to capabilities the peacetime economy couldn't use. William Boeing himself had sold his stake in the company years earlier. Forced out by antitrust regulations in 1934. The enterprise bearing his name now belonged to shareholders and managers who had to figure out how to keep it alive. The answer came from the sky, but not from bombers. Jet propulsion was transforming aviation. The Germans had pioneered jet fighters during the war. The British were advancing the technology rapidly. Boeing recognized that the future belonged to jets, and they pivoted hard. In 1947, they flew the XB-47 Stratojet, a revolutionary bomber design featuring swept wings and 6 jet engines. It looked nothing like the propeller-driven aircraft that had won the war. It looked like the future. The Cold War saved Boeing. As tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, the American military realized it needed a new generation of strategic bombers, aircraft capable of delivering nuclear weapons across intercontinental distances. Boeing won the contract for the B-52 Stratofortress, a massive 8-engine jet bomber that could fly 8,000 miles without refueling. The first B-52 flew in 1952. Let that sink in. Variants of that aircraft remain in service today, more than 7 decades later. The facilities that had been built for wartime production found new purpose. Plant 2 in Seattle, the factory that had hidden beneath its fake neighborhood, continued operating. The camouflage was long gone, but the industrial infrastructure remained valuable. Boeing invested in modernization, updating equipment, expanding capabilities. The Renton facility that had produced B-29s transitioned to commercial aircraft production. The company wasn't just surviving, it was adapting. The commercial aviation breakthrough came with the 707, Boeing's first jet airliner. Introduced in 1958, the 707 revolutionized air travel. It could carry 181 passengers at speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Transcontinental flights that had taken 12 hours by propeller aircraft now took 5. Transatlantic crossings became routine. The 707 made Boeing synonymous with commercial aviation, establishing a dominance that would last for decades. The transformation was remarkable. A company that had nearly collapsed in 1946 had reinvented itself as the world's preeminent aircraft manufacturer. The Seattle area facilities that had hemorrhaged workers after the war were once again humming with production. Employment climbed back toward wartime levels. Though the workforce composition had changed, the women and minorities who had filled the factories during the war were largely absent from the post-war prosperity. The jobs went to white men, many of them veterans, building a middle class that excluded those who had helped create it. The sites themselves evolved with the company. Plant 2 underwent continuous renovation. its original structures modified and expanded to accommodate new production methods. The Renton facility became the primary assembly point for commercial aircraft, eventually producing the 737 that would become the best-selling jetliner in history. New facilities spread across the Puget Sound region, transforming the entire area into an aerospace hub. Boeing became Seattle's identity, its largest employer, its most prominent corporate citizen. But the environmental legacy of wartime production lingered beneath the surface. The Duwamish River, which had absorbed decades of industrial runoff, became one of the most polluted waterways in America. In 2001, the Environmental Protection Agency designated a 5-mile stretch of the river as a Superfund site, requiring extensive cleanup funded partially by Boeing and other industrial polluters. The contamination included arsenic, lead, mercury, PCBs, dozens of other toxic substances. Fish caught in the river contained levels of carcinogens that made them unsafe to eat. The communities along the Duwamish, many of them working class and minority, bore the health consequences of pollution that had accumulated over generations. The cleanup efforts continue to this day. Billions of dollars have been spent dredging contaminated sediment, capping polluted areas, restoring habitat. The work will take decades more to complete. The people who dumped the waste are mostly dead. The companies that created it have transformed beyond recognition. But the poison remains. A physical reminder of the hidden costs of industrial triumph. The workers who built the wartime bombers faded into history along with their stories. Most never received recognition for their contributions. The narratives that emerged focused on military heroism, on pilots and soldiers, on the technologies themselves. The human beings who made those technologies possible were forgotten, their sacrifices unacknowledged. Oral history projects have captured some testimonies, but most of those workers died without ever telling their stories. The women who proved they could do any job were written out of the official record. The minorities who helped win the war returned to segregation and discrimination. Today, the sites where the camouflaged factories once stood look nothing like they did in 1945. Plant 2 was demolished in stages over the decades, its functions consolidated into newer facilities. The land was redeveloped. Roads and buildings now cover ground where fake neighborhoods once fooled enemy reconnaissance. The Boeing Field area remains an industrial zone, home to various aviation-related businesses, but the specific geography of the wartime operation has been erased. The Renton facility still produces aircraft. Walk through its enormous assembly building, and you can watch 737s taking shape, fuselages arriving by rail, wings being attached, systems being installed. The scale remains impressive, though the workforce is smaller than wartime peaks thanks to automation and efficiency improvements. The workers who assemble jets today have no direct connection to those who built B-29s in the same location 80 years ago. The continuity is institutional, not personal. Memorials exist, but they're scattered and modest. Historical markers note Boeing's contributions to the war effort. Museums display artifacts and photographs. But there's no major monument to the workers who made it all possible. No recognition commensurate with their sacrifice. The camouflage that hid the factory has become a historical curiosity, a fun fact mentioned in documentaries and articles. The human stories behind it remain largely untold. Boeing today stands as one of the largest aerospace companies on Earth. Their aircraft dominate commercial aviation. Their defense contracts generate billions in revenue. The company employs over 140,000 people worldwide, a workforce that dwarfs even the wartime peaks. From a wealthy lumberman's hobby to a global industrial giant, the trajectory seems like pure American success, but look closer. And the patterns that defined the hidden factory era keep repeating. The 737 MAX crisis revealed something uncomfortable about modern Boeing. In 2018 and 2019, two crashes killed 346 people. Lion Air Flight 610 went down in Indonesia. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed in Ethiopia. Both aircraft were Boeing 737 MAX 8 jets. Both crashes resulted from a flawed automated system called MCAS that pilots couldn't override. Investigations revealed that Boeing had known about potential problems. They had prioritized schedule and cost over safety. They had hidden information from regulators and airlines. The parallels to the wartime era are striking. Then, secrecy served national security. Now, secrecy served corporate interests. Then, workers were pushed to produce faster, cutting corners that compromised safety. Now, engineers reported being pressured to approve designs they had concerns about. Then, the human costs were treated as acceptable. Now, 346 people died because Boeing prioritized profits over their lives. The camouflage has changed, but the underlying dynamics remain hauntingly similar. The aftermath of the MAX crisis exposed deeper problems. Whistleblowers came forward describing a corporate culture that punished dissent and rewarded compliance. Quality control issues plagued production lines. Workers reported finding debris inside aircraft, tools left in fuselages, bolts that weren't properly secured. The company that had built an empire on engineering excellence seemed to have forgotten what engineering excellence meant. The MBAs had won. The accountants ran the show, and people died. In January 2024, an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 suffered an explosive decompression when a door plug blew out at 16,000 feet. Passengers sat next to a gaping hole in the fuselage as the plane made an emergency landing. Miraculously, no one died. But the incident reinforced what the earlier crashes had demonstrated. Something fundamental had gone wrong at Boeing. The company that had hidden factories to protect national security was now hiding problems that endangered passengers. So what can we learn from Boeing's journey? From the fake neighborhoods that concealed bomber production to the corporate culture that concealed safety failures. The lessons are painful, but essential. Lesson 1. Secrecy has a shelf life. The wartime camouflage worked brilliantly for its intended purpose. It protected critical infrastructure from enemy attack. But secrecy becomes dangerous when it outlives its justification. Boeing's habit of concealment, born in wartime necessity, metastasized into a corporate culture that hid problems from regulators, customers, and even its own employees. Secrets that serve legitimate purposes can become secrets that serve only to avoid accountability. The transition happens gradually, invisibly, until the damage is done. Lesson 2. Workers are not expendable. The men and women who built bombers during World War II gave everything they had. They sacrificed their health, their families, their futures. When the war ended, they were discarded without ceremony or support. Boeing extracted their labor and moved on. That same mentality persists in corporate America today. Workers are resources to be optimized, costs to be minimized, problems to be managed. But workers are also the people who catch mistakes, who notice problems, who maintain the quality that keeps aircraft safe. When you treat them as expendable, you lose the institutional knowledge and ethical grounding that prevent disasters. Lesson 3. Victory doesn't erase the cost. Boeing won World War II, or at least contributed mightily to that victory. The bombers built beneath the camouflage helped defeat fascism, but the victory didn't clean up the pollution in the Duwamish River. It didn't heal the workers who developed cancers from chemical exposure. It didn't restore the communities disrupted by rapid mobilization and abandonment. Success has costs. Those costs don't disappear just because the mission was accomplished. They accumulate, compound, and eventually demand payment. The Superfund cleanup is still ongoing. The environmental debt is still being paid. Lesson 4. corporate memory is dangerously short. The Boeing of 1945 was a company that had proven it could do the impossible. They had hidden factories, built bombers at unprecedented rates, helped win a global war. That institutional knowledge should have created a culture of excellence, of attention to detail, of respect for the complexity of aircraft manufacturing. Instead, successive generations of management forgot the lessons. They prioritized financial metrics over engineering integrity. They cut costs in ways that compromised safety. They lost touch with what made Boeing great in the first place. Institutional memory requires active maintenance. Without it, organizations repeat the mistakes of the past, while congratulating themselves on their innovation. The story of Boeing's hidden factories is ultimately a story about what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore. The camouflage worked because it gave observers what they expected to see: a neighborhood, houses, streets, or trees. The mind filled in the details, accepted the illusion, moved on. We do the same thing with corporate narratives. We see the success stories, the innovation, the progress. We don't see the workers discarded after their usefulness ends. We don't see the pollution seeping into groundwater. We don't see the corners cut to meet quarterly targets. The fake suburb that covered Plant 2 has been gone for decades. The workers who built it are mostly dead. The bombers they produced have been scrapped or retired to museums. But the patterns established during those hidden years persist. The willingness to sacrifice people for production. The reliance on secrecy to avoid scrutiny. The assumption that victory justifies any cost. These aren't historical artifacts. They're active forces shaping corporate behavior today. Boeing built an empire by hiding in plain sight. They concealed factories from enemies and concealed problems from regulators. They used workers during wartime and discarded them in peacetime. They polluted communities and left others to clean up the mess. The camouflage was brilliant. The consequences were devastating. And the lessons keep demanding to be learned. The next time you board a commercial aircraft, you're trusting your life to systems designed by engineers, built by workers, and approved by regulators. You're trusting that the people responsible for those systems prioritized safety over profit, transparency over concealment, human life over corporate convenience. The history of Boeing suggests that trust may not always be warranted. The fake neighborhood is gone. The secrets have been exposed. The workers have been forgotten. But the story continues, written in contaminated soil, in regulatory failures, in the names of 346 people who boarded aircraft that should never have flown. What we build in the dark eventually comes to light. What we hide from others, we often hide from ourselves. And what we refuse to see can still destroy us.